yesterday, managed to get some sleep.
Yes.
Not to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning because of the jet lag. But today we have a very exciting session in the morning. It's about teaching fundamental principles for teaching foreign languages. And we have a wonderful presenter. Scott MCginnis is a very experienced trainer, and he's from Defense Language Institute. He has been leading as the executive director of the National Council of Organizations of Less Commonly Taught Languages. So he has done very many trainings with teachers, both with Chinese teachers and with Arabic teachers. So please welcome. Without further ado, session is yours.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Pleasure to meet you all face to face. Having seen your photographs in, you do look like your photographs, I will say. I want to tell you a little bit about myself first so you'll understand, first of all, where I'm coming from. I am first and foremost, like all of you, at heart a student. I've been at it for a few decades longer than I think some of you have been at it. I started out my language learning life back at 6th grade, learning Spanish, which didn't stick. I spent 4 years learning Latin in high school, which, needless to say, there aren't a lot of native speakers of Latin out there anymore to speak with. But most of my language learning and then language teaching life was spent learning Chinese and then learning Japanese. Now, I want to tell you that in some ways, for those of you that are Chinese teachers in particular, I didn't choose to learn Chinese. In the mid-1970s, I was having a little bit of, shall I say, difficulty in college. I was having a very good time, but I wasn't being very conscientious about being a college student. So I left college, went into the military, and decided or wanted to be a linguist. So when you are in the military, they frequently give you something called a dream sheet. You put down what languages you would maybe like to learn, and they will decide what language you are going to learn. The languages I put down were Russian, because it was the 1970s and there were a lot of employment opportunities in the long term. I put down Greek because I thought it would be a good chance to maybe go to the Mediterranean Sea and see the scenery, and it was sort of in the same area as Latin. And then I put down a language called Serbian Croatian because I thought if it was a language that was so different it needed 2 names instead of just one, it must be pretty interesting. However, when I received my orders to go to my language school, I found a long series of numbers, and buried in the middle of it were these 2 letters, CM. And I thought, well, probably not Russian, probably not Greek, kind of a stretch for Serbian Croatian. And so I went up to the gentleman who was in charge of our orders and I said, excuse me, what language am I going to be learning? And he went down his cheat sheet and said, oh, Chinese, Mandarin. So the moral of the story is that even if you think you have a choice, you don't necessarily have a choice, but like those of you in this room, you didn't choose to learn Arabic and you didn't choose to learn Chinese. You grew up learning Arabic and grew up learning Chinese. So nonetheless, it has been very interesting. I spent about 15 years teaching Chinese, first as a graduate student, and then after I received my doctorate in colleges and universities. And then, as Zara was saying, I worked with an organization that dealt in less commonly taught languages, of which Chinese and Arabic are 2 of the less commonly taught languages. And more recently, I've been working with the Defense Language Institute in Washington, D.C., for which we arrange training in 60 to 70 different languages. So I no longer have the luxury to only be able to focus on Chinese. I have to know a little bit about 60 or 70 languages in terms of what the resources are. But I do not speak or read 60 or 70 languages. I still do Chinese, but I haven't taught it for several years, and I still do a little bit of Japanese. That was the other language I learned. Now, what we're going to be talking about today, and what I would like to spend this morning doing, is to give you a chance to get to know the national standards, and specifically something that is called the 5 C's. How many of you have heard of the national standards? And I'm talking about the American national standards. How many of you have heard of those? Okay. You are not alone. There are a lot of people in the United States that do not know about national standards. By the end of this morning, you will know more about the national standards than probably the majority of the American population, with the exception of those that work in K through 12. Now, I want to emphasize, I think from your own experience, when you talk about education, it's much more centrally controlled. You have in your countries, I believe, I know in China it's the case, something that would be called the Ministry of Education. And what the Ministry of Education does is it sets standards for throughout the country in areas including curriculum, what is expected before graduation, what you have to know and what you have to achieve test scores on to get into universities. The United States is not like that. We do not have a Ministry of Education. Everything is much more locally controlled on a state-by-state basis. And as I'm sure you will find out during the course of this year, as you are in communication with your fellow teachers, the standards in, for example, a state like Montana may be significantly different in many ways than it is in California or in the District of Columbia. What the standards do is allow us to talk in general terms about what we expect a student can do at the end of a sequence of foreign language courses. But keep in mind that what you're being presented here isn't necessarily what you're going to see in each and every school setting that you find yourself. What they help you to do, those of us that worked on the national standards, is we think it helps teachers become better, because in the same way that you knew when you took your college entrance test what sort of things were expected of you, the national standards help us better prepare our students in what we think a student can do with a language when they get done. So in a sense, it's less important that you know these standards word for word than what you know about these standards in terms of what it helps you do with your students. Every one of you will be in a slightly different setting. As I said, I read your biographies and where you're going to be, and you're going to be in a lot of very different places. I was amazed that there was even one place that I recognized. One of you, I believe, is going to Missoula, Montana. My uncle lives in Missoula, Montana. He is not a school teacher, but he lives in Missoula, Montana. So let's begin. What we're going to also be doing today, this is, I know you're still sort of getting over the jet lag and getting over the culture shock and so forth. But what I want to be doing today is have a chance to get to know both your fellow Chinese teachers or Arabic teachers in your language specific areas, but also for you Chinese teachers maybe to get to know your Arabic counterparts a bit better. So we'll be doing some group work throughout the course of the morning. Hopefully that will help you, number one, not just so much stay awake, but also help you get to know each other a little bit better. So let me go over, to begin, the 5 standards. And I think you all will have packets in front of you that will include these slides. So you might, if you want to, you might be able to take notes on it as we go through, but you don't have to take notes on it. The 5 C's refer to what are the aspects of language learning, what are the outcomes of language learning. Now, if you look at the first 2 of these, generally speaking, these are the ones probably that make a great deal of sense, because it's what, regardless of what you have taught in your life, whether it was English or Arabic and Chinese, the first one is the most important. You want to be able to communicate in the language. Cultures refers to, you don't just communicate in a cultural vacuum. In other words, it's not enough just to be fluent. It's not enough just to be accurate in your pronunciation and your grammar. You want to act in a way that is culturally appropriate. Otherwise, if you're not behaving in a culturally appropriate manner, all you are is being very fluent and potentially offending the person you are talking with. It's not enough just to be fluent. You have to be culturally sensitive. The last 3 are probably ones that may seem a little bit different to you, and in fact, for a lot of American foreign language teachers, these were very different when they first came out. For example, we tend to think of subject areas. In other words, when you go through school, you study math, you study science, you study social studies, and if you've got time in your schedule, you maybe study a foreign language too. The idea of connections means that you can actually use your foreign language to gain knowledge about other disciplines, including math, including science. And there are, in fact, a number of very unique programs in the United States, including one not far from here in Potomac, Maryland, where elementary school students are using Chinese to study math and science. In other words, they are learning math and learning science, but they are learning it in Chinese. And there are a number of other models that are out there as well. Not every school does this. In fact, relatively few schools do that. But the idea is that we want to weave together different disciplines so that you don't think of subjects not unconnected with each other. Comparisons. One of the things that I'm sure that you in your experience of learning English have discovered is that you actually, when you have to compare Arabic or Chinese with English, you not only learn those foreign languages, you learn more about your own language, because you're having to think about how, as is the case I know from personal experience, how Chinese is so very different from English in terms of grammar. You start thinking more about your own language. And as you will be spending the next year doing, as you are exposed to American culture, you are already, I'm sure, perhaps even in the last 24 hours, discovering how different American culture is from Chinese or Arabic culture. So that's one of the best advantages that I have always found of learning a foreign language. You get to know your own language and culture better. And finally, the other thing that we and you I'm sure think is very important is it's not so important what you do with your students in the language classroom. What is more important is what your students do after they leave the language classroom. What your students of Chinese and Arabic will do in interacting with Chinese and Arabic speakers throughout their community, and ultimately we would hope throughout the world. The value that they take out there is that, as is in the case of Chinese, it's not just they can communicate with you, the teacher, they're going to be able to communicate with about 20% of the human race, hopefully someday. And that's very, very exciting for them. And that's a very strong motivating factor for students. It's not that they don't want to communicate with you, they want to be able to communicate with the broader world. In the same way that when you have been studying English, you can now communicate not just with your English teacher back wherever you studied English, you can communicate with people throughout the world. Now, some of these things I've already touched upon, and again, it's consistent with what we think about when we go through our education. The standards are meant to be interwoven. By that I mean is that you know what smokestacks are, or stovepipes. You don't want to think of these 5 C's as separate stovepipes or smokestacks. They're meant to be interwoven, and hopefully what we'll be seeing today, you'll be seeing some ways in which they can ultimately be interwoven. Equally important, and again, this goes to the fact that when you go to your school systems, you're not necessarily, and in fact, you probably won't see the 5 C's as word for word what you are used as the standard for your teaching. Equally important, just because there are 5 C's doesn't mean you have to address all 5 of them each and every day that you teach. But you want to be thinking in terms of those 5 C's because they can help make you better able to help your students communicate in the language. And there are some activities that are more appropriate for communities, for connections, but not necessarily every activity. And we'll be showing you something in a minute that will help you be thinking in terms of that. Generally speaking, the first 2 C's, communication and culture, are the ones that are easiest to address. And I suspect that in your teaching experience, even if you didn't use these labels, you were every day teaching your students to communicate, and you will always, in your new classes, be teaching your students to communicate. And as I saw reflected in many of your statements explicitly, you want the students to be able to understand more about the culture you bring into the classroom. And when the 5 C's were first introduced, as teachers started to think about them in terms of their own teaching design, communication and culture were pretty easy. Teachers have been doing that for centuries now. They've been teaching students to communicate. They've been teaching students to be culturally competent. But the connections to other disciplines, the comparisons to other cultures, and the communities were aspects of language education that teachers hadn't thought about as much. And as we started to see textbooks that incorporated the 5 C's, textbooks didn't necessarily address those as quickly. But now teachers are starting to think more in terms of that. These are very general sorts of things that, again, you as teachers, I'm sure, have in many cases already been doing. But the idea, first of all, is that as we look at the standards in the same way that you had goals for when you were students in your countries, is that you want to set goals for the students. There's a term that you will hear about, I suspect, in the next several weeks, something called backward design. How many of you have heard of the term backward design? Okay, backward design basically means instead of just doing a lesson plan, taking it into the classroom, and once you've covered it, you feel you've succeeded. You want to think in terms of what do you want your students to be able to do at the end of a class hour? And then by extension, what would you want your students to be able to do at the end of a week, or the end of a semester, or the end of a year? So once you know where your students should be, or in consultation with other teachers you are working with in your program, once you know where your students should be at the end of different periods of time, you do backward design. How are the steps that you're going to be able to take them to that end? So set your goals, plan activities. I would emphasize once again, as I said earlier, that communication and culture will be in each and every class, but the other ones, the connections, the comparisons, and the communities at various times also should be a part of your class activities. List available resources. You are fortunate in that while audiovisual and internet resources for Chinese and Arabic are still limited compared to, say, Spanish or French or German, they are greater than they used to be, and they continue to grow. And as opposed to, say, a language like Hungarian or Somali or Punjabi, there are a whole lot more resources out there. Now, some of you will be going into settings in which there's a lot of electronic or internet resources available. Some of you will probably, I venture to say, go into schools where there aren't a lot of supplementary materials, electronic or internet. But in any event, as you plan your activities, you want to know what your resources are. And of course, that will be part of your process as you begin at your schools to know what's available. So we're not going to spend time today, that is my 3 hours today. I'm not going to be talking a lot about electronic media. I notice on the schedule you will have some other individuals coming in talking about those sorts of things. But again, it will vary from school to school, but you want to know what your resources are. Plan and prune. Do you know what pruning is? It's when you trim the branches of a tree. One of my recollections of when I was first starting to teach is that the biggest mistakes that you make is that you don't have enough materials to fill a 40 or 50-minute classes. And I'm sure at least some of you have had that awful sinking feeling of having a lesson plan that you thought was going to be more than enough for 40 or 50 minutes, and all of a sudden you're 15 minutes into the class and you have nothing more to do with the students. So at the beginning, the hardest thing is making sure you have enough activities to do. Then, once you get more experience, then the problem becomes you've got too much to do. You always want to have a backup plan so that if a student group gets through the materials more quickly, you've got something that you can do with them. But as I said, it's the two extremes. When you start, you don't have enough for a class hour. When you get farther along, you have way too much for a class hour. So the planning and the pruning. And finally, I want to say involve your students. Again, this is something that is important as you deal with this foreign culture that is American culture. As I said, I understand that in your own experience, some things are a little easier because the government or the Ministry of Education says what the students are expected to learn. In your school settings that you're going into, depending on what the school setting is, students may have a greater degree of involvement. That is to say, They will be more saying the sorts of things that they would like to be learning about. Now, the student doesn't know best in terms of what they need to know to become proficient in the language. That's your job. That's your experience. That's your expertise. But, as you know, depending on what sort of background you've been in, the more you reflect what students are interested in, the more interested they will be in your class. And this is going to be part of your process as you begin. Every student population is going to be different, as you know. So getting to know what sorts of things they're interested in. For example, I know some of you are going into high schools of science and technology. Those students are going to be much more interested, hopefully, in things involving science and technology. If you're in a more general secondary school setting, they're going to be interested in a wider range of things potentially. But the key is involve your students, because the more interested they are in what they're studying, the better they're going to be probably as language learners. Now, what we're going to do before we continue to break down into each one of the individual standards is I'd like you to pull out somewhere in your course packet. There's something that says Figure 1.3 evaluation form. It's a table. Yeah, you got it.
No. And the number what?
Six.
Going to be a table. Somebody, is there a page number or
Six.
Six.
Yeah. I should also say, prior to that, in your notebooks, you'll see that there are the listing of the standards. Unfortunately, they only have the Chinese characters for the Chinese standards. For the Arabic ones, they did not include the Arabic script for them, but that's just for your reference purposes. Those are with specific reference to Chinese and Arabic, the standards. Has everybody found this evaluation form, Figure 1.3? Now, this is taken from a book called Bringing the Standards to Life, and I will, on the breaks, if you want to copy down the reference for this, you might want to, at some point, as you're acquiring materials for your teaching, take a look at it. The nice thing about this is it has a variety of activities addressing each one of the standards. They're kind of general. They're not specifically for Chinese or Arabic. They cite examples in other languages, but the principles behind the standards, these activities, can apply to any language, including Chinese and Arabic. So it's just another tool that you might want to consider for, at a later point, to help you with your own lesson planning. The writer for this book, Deborah Blas, uses a metaphor of the big rock. And the big rock simply means what is a very broad topic area that you're wanting students to be able to perform in the language. Some of you may come from backgrounds where you've talked about a functional, notional curriculum design. The idea is that these are broad sorts of topics like health matters, family, food, holidays, and different broad topic areas are going to be the key parts of your curriculum. So she uses big rock to refer to those big topic areas, such as you'll see in your notebooks, being able to talk about health matters. Now, I put this in here not so that you have to necessarily use it, but as something that might help you as you think about organizing activities. And in particular, as you get to know the curriculum you're working in, the guidelines for what your curriculum is going to be, it's a useful way for you to be thinking about how the 5 C's can be incorporated in your own curriculum, regardless of what the curricular guidelines are. So you'll see that this evaluation form will include at the top communication, culture, connections, comparisons, and communities, the 5 C's. And underneath there, there's sort of an abbreviated reference to the subcategories under each of the 5 C's. And we'll talk about these subcategories throughout the course of this morning. So it's just sort of a shorthand to talk about the subcategories. You see under communication, for example, interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. That's just basically abbreviations. What may be helpful for you to be thinking in terms of the 5 C's is as you lay out lessons for particular topic areas, you can use this to do different sorts of activities that would address the 5 C's. And so now if you flip to the next page, where it says figure 1.5 evaluation form, you see an example of how, at the top of the page, you see Big Rock, students will be able to discuss their health and what they do to remain in good health. What you see there is a listing of different activities. For example, number 1, describe activities people do to be physically fit in USA and target culture. So this will sort of help you be thinking in terms of how you can address these different sorts of 5 C's in your curriculum design. And it goes on to the next page as well too. It gives more examples of activities. And you can adapt something like this. As I said, when you go to your school districts, they're going to have probably different sorts of sets of standards. Things that are like the 5 C's, but that aren't identical to the 5 C's. And this helps you think in terms of ways that you could address those in your class activity. Now, to talk about communication. Traditionally, and I'm sure for you as well, this was your experience as well, we've traditionally talked about what are called the 4 modalities, or the 4 sub-skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. In the 5 C's, you're still dealing with speaking, listening, reading, and writing, but they use a different sort of label on it. If we talk about interpersonal communication, what do you think that would involve when you're talking about between speaking, listening, reading, and writing? Speaking and listening. We do want to listen instead of just speaking to people. But by the same token, when we talk about interpersonal, we can also talk about writing and reading. The idea is it's two-way communication. It's not just speaking without listening to the person. It's not just writing without having someone read what you wrote. So the idea is you're a two-way communication, provided obtaining information, expressing feelings and emotions, exchanging opinions. The focus is on exchange. So we're still talking about speaking, listening, reading, and writing. We're talking about it just more in communication. Now, there are times when you want students to listen and they're not necessarily going to have to speak. And you want students to read and they're not necessarily going to have to write anything down. That's what's called interpretive communication. So that's more of a case in which it's not two-way communication. It's simply students being able to understand what they hear and what they read. Now, sometimes you're going to be hearing people talking about a text Now, when we talk about text, traditionally, what do we think in terms of? Is it spoken language or written language? It's usually written language, but I just want to, in American educational parlance, increasingly people talk about texts to include not only written text, but something that is spoken. So don't be confused that when somebody's talking about a text, it's not always necessarily going to be something for reading. It may also be something that they're listening to. It's just a technical term that gets increasingly used. But the focus is, again, interpret language on a variety of topics. And then finally, presentational. There are times that you want your students to be able to present. They're not necessarily going to be going back and forth, but there are times, for example, if you want them to do an oral presentation or a written composition, that's presentational communication, to present information, concepts, and ideas. So we're still talking about, even though when people first started looking at the 5 C's, some of the initial reaction is, well, where's speaking, listening, reading, and writing? Well, it's all there. It's just that the labels that are used are somewhat different. And I am quite sure that regardless of where you are going to teach, you're going to hear these terms because of all the aspects of the 5 C's that seem to appear pretty universally, no matter what school district you go into. These are the terms that get used. It's not that people aren't still teaching, speaking, listening, reading, and writing. It's just that this is the terminology that gets used. And part of your ability to be able to function within the American setting is to understand. Once again, as I said at the start of the hour, many people, including parents and administrators, may not necessarily be as familiar with these terms as you will be. These are things that, once again, I am sure are things that have guided you in your own teaching experience, but it always is helpful to be reminded of them. The first being that when you are teaching for communication, you've got to have something that is comprehensible. If you would only be speaking at the level that you are used to communicating with your native speaker friends, for most of your students, it's probably going to be incomprehensible. However, it's important to emphasize that you don't necessarily have to have students understand everything you say. Because in the real world, when you are functioning amongst a bunch of speakers of English, will you necessarily understand each and every word? When you are reading an English language publication, unless you have the luxury of time to sit there with a dictionary and read word by word, are you going to understand everything you read? When I read the Washington Post in the morning, there are some times that I don't necessarily know a particular word that I run across. But we make our understanding possible by building from what we know and sometimes making educated guesses about what we don't know. There is a term that has been used by an American language theorist, Stephen Krashen, called I+1. Does that ring any bells? I refers to comprehensible input. That is to say, everything that you hear that is comprehensible, that you understand. The +1 means that you add something more, a bit beyond what the person can understand. Why do you do that? If you only present what you know the students can understand completely,
it's not a challenge.
or they continue to grow in the language, they won't. You always want to provide them with something a little bit beyond what they know. That's the +1 piece of it. So when we say comprehensible, that doesn't mean everything is necessarily completely comprehensible, but there has to be enough that is
To build up on.
be able to understand so that they can go above that. Interesting. That may seem obvious, but once again, I'm sure you have been through classes in English in which a topic was presented to you and you had no interest in it whatsoever. Now, it may have been important for you to learn that topic area, but if everything you read was uninteresting and everything you listened to was uninteresting, would you have stayed with English as long as you have? Probably not. You would not be here today if everything you had to read and listen to was terribly boring. And again, many of you have already been working with students that are at a secondary school level, or even in some cases a primary school level. And you know what is interesting to them may not necessarily be what you find most interesting, but you have to be able to make it interesting to help build what? Relevancy, that it has some connection with their life, and probably even more important, motivating. You want the students to want to learn. The fortunate thing that you have as language teachers, and particularly language teachers of languages like Arabic and Chinese, is that with rare exception, nobody will be there because they have to be there. Students have to take math. Students have to take science. Students have to take social studies and language arts. One of the advantages I had in teaching Chinese in college is nobody had to study Chinese. They were there because they wanted to be. But you do want to still motivate them to want to keep learning the language. Increasing the comfort levels. Now this has some relevance to the I+1. You don't want the students to be too comfortable, because if they're too comfortable, if they know everything you give to them, what will happen? They'll get bored. They'll get bored, they won't progress, they won't be motivated. So make them comfortable, but don't make them lazy. That's the difference, I guess, you have to keep in mind. Using small group activities. Now, I know in some cases you don't have the luxury of really small group activities. You may have relatively large classes. But breaking up the class size, as we're going to be doing today, is useful for making it motivating, interesting, and relevant. And a variety of activities. I think I saw that, what day was it? You're going to be talking about multiple intelligences next week. I think it's on the 1st. And the idea behind multiple intelligences is that students have different sorts of learning styles. They have different sorts of ways in which they learn best. So what you want to appeal to are different learning styles. Some students learn very well with a lot of auditory sound input. Some students really need a lot of what they can see to reinforce. And no two students are going to be identical. And no two classes are going to be identical in terms of those aspects. So you want to use a variety of activities. All right. What I'm going to ask you to do now is we're going to do the first of a series of activities. Now I want to emphasize I'm not asking you to come up with a lesson plan. This is your second day here, and I'm not expecting you to come up with a lesson plan. But what I'd like you to be starting to think in terms of is that from what we've learned so far about communication, interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational, think about what sorts of activities you could do to help the students learning, practicing, acquiring skills related to being able to talk about their families. Okay? So what I'm going to be doing this morning is I'm going to be mixing it up. Sometimes you're going to be working with your language-specific fellow teachers. For this first one, what I'd like to do is have you break up into groups with about 3, I think there's 10 of you Arabic, there's 10 Arabic teachers and 15 Chinese teachers. What I'd like you to do is break into 3 groups. with about 3 teachers of Arabic and about, for that one group will have to have 4 teachers of Arabic because there's 10 of you, and 5 Chinese teachers. What I'd like you to do is do what's called brainstorming. Do you know the term brainstorm? Okay. Come up with some ideas for what could be an activity that you could do that would be related to family. Try to come up with one that would involve interpersonal communication, that is, in which the students actually have to work with each other. And when I say come up with an activity, don't say something as vague as have the students talk to each other about their family. Have a little bit more focus to it than that. And in presentational, think in terms of what sorts of activities they could do, a presentational form of communication, and what they could do in terms of an interpretive form of communication. Now, what I'm also going to ask you to do is that as you break up into these groups, we have these flip charts over here. And what I'd like you to do is to just put down the basics. As I said, I don't need a lesson plan, but I need you just so that you can remember and be able to talk about it with the group, the basics of the activity. Now, I know we have 4 tables, and we have marking pens. See, are we pretty well, looks like 3,